Last year, I did what I hadn't done, in so long. I went back to my Cambridge college for the college feast. Sitting then in May week, with the great bells chiming over me, in the master's garden, a rose garden, beautiful buttresses flying, and roses mingle, a marvel then of scent and scintillating light. I remember all the windows in the colleges were catching the sun as it started to wester, so the roses let loose their perfume, and the red light of the windows burned like a fire. And I asked the master whether he thought emotions haunted places that they had once been. For it seemed to me, sitting in the rose garden, I was 20 again, so long, long ago. And all the youth that had always been there, in that city of colour and shade, of fog and burning bright light, of intellect and learning. All that hope was a heady drug. Now I had meant it as poetry, I think, but the master looked at me strange and said, "Have you heard then what happened in this place? Perhaps he was a little after your time. Do you remember Collins?" And I thought back. And it was a long time after I was there, but I had kept up my interest in the college, and I said, "Wasn't he a fellow here?" "Yes, elected 5 years ago. But if you look on the lists now, you won't find him there." "Why? What happened?" "The poor fellow is in an institution." "And do you mean he's gone to Oxford?" "Oh, I do not. I mean he now resides in Bodmin, in a house for the clinically insane." That's a heavy story to bring up on a bright summer's evening. Maybe. But maybe it is the only time I want to talk about it and to ask you what I should do with the book he gave me. He sent it to me the other year, perhaps 2 years ago, and I have kept it in my library ever since. "Tell me, who is Collins?" "Oh, he was the finest medievalist and teacher of Latin this university had ever had. That really difficult late medieval Latin. It was his speciality. He was an expert then in Catholicism, in the rituals of the late medieval period. And he was born in Cornwall and had connections to some of the greatest Cornish families. Even to those families around Redruth that had never converted to Protestantism, that are up there in Canas. They have a large house. I remember he was often talking about his relatives, and he used to say, one day they will make my fortune," which I suppose they did, but not as he meant it. Yes. Well, that house once had owned all of Western Cornwall, but after the Reformation and their refusing to adopt the new form of religion, they fell out of favour. But still, up until last century, they had a sizable estate. But then 3 ruinous earls left nothing for the estate. And in the end, there were 2 heirs. The direct line, an old woman, deep in her Catholicism, and an indirect cousin, who was a distant relation on the other side, it had to be said, to Collins. And, well, The old woman was a famous Tartar. She would have a string of priests come and sing in her chapel, and she would drive them all to distraction, for she insisted they must eat the diet of the early saints, a diet she too had, whose principal features was dry, hard biscuit bread and brandy, old brandy. Well, the second bit seems all right. My thoughts entirely, but you can't live off brandy alone. In the end, the last priest who come to work for her had been a very melancholy man, a French Jesuit, who had come with some history of his own, people thought, for he was often seen looking into the dark. But anyway, he had not been able to leave, and so, in the space of 2 years, she had driven the poor chap mad with brandy and with demands that he got up in the middle of the night and sung the Holy Eucharist, that he celebrated Mass on all the saints' days, that he learnt the names of the saints. As I said, she was a termagant. Now in all of this, she was not behaving in any other way than she behaved to herself, but she expected the priests to conform to her religion. So what happened to him? Well, a year before the old lady herself died, he was found on the 3rd of November in the chapel, quite mad, staring out, saying, "It must happen again, it cannot be the last," as if he had seen a ghost. And, well, they took him to Bodmin, but I'm afraid they didn't monitor him very carefully. He reverted to speaking only French, and they found him hung in the grounds the next year, in November. And the old lady? The old lady. This last was more than the Archbishop could bear, so he wrote to the Pope, who obtained a bill, or published a bull of excommunication. But when she heard that bull was coming, she travelled around all those houses, the great houses that she had helped over her years of prosperity, nuns and monks who felt duty bound to look after her, so the bull never reached her. And formerly she died in the peace of her religion in Worcestershire. And so the estate passed on to her cousin, who was already a baronet and became the earl. But he was an old man. He had no relatives of his own, apart from, on the other side, Collins. And so, as Collins predicted, he was summoned, not, I hope you understand, as an heir, but as an archivist. It would be his job to record all that could be recorded of that old great house. When it was all over, I had him come to stay with. He invited me to stay, and I didn't want to go, but I had him up here in my rooms, and he told me how the night that Collins had stayed, November the 2nd, All Souls Night, yes, by ill chance, they had stayed up late looking at the archivists and the great papers from days from the 12th century, would you believe? Deeds that gave all of Cornwall to his great barons, to the barons and the earls of which he was the heir. Reivers he used to call them. For Cornwall, you must know, was a wild land then, even wilder than it is today, and its earls were little more than thieves in chief. And then the baronet turned to talking of his predecessor, the woman, and he sat and laughed with the memories of how she had eluded the Pope's excommunication and what she had done to all her priests. And then he said, "Let us try the brandy." And he took it out, and it was wild and heady. Now Collins, you must know, was an abstemious chap, but there was something about that brandy. He couldn't stop drinking until he had had far too much for him, and the servants had to put him to bed. And now I'm going to rely on a curious document. You see, after it was all over, he sent me jottings he had made in one of his books, a copy, would you believe, of Diogenes Laertes he had written in the margins. I'm writing sitting up in the bed. I cannot sleep. I don't know why I'm writing in this book, but it is all I have at hand for paper. I keep on thinking, he wrote, of the priest who went mad, possibly in this room. And this room is beyond anything I have ever seen. There's an Adam's fireplace, would you believe, and a great bed which is terribly uncomfortable. And I can't bear to blow out the candle. I think it's because I'm looking at the room. But to be honest, the thought of being in this room with its marble statues that could be moving for all I know makes me scared. Perhaps it's just the brandy, but it is gone 12, and here I sit bolt upright. And then he said he decided that he would have to get a book to read, but he was miles away from the library downstairs, so he looked around, and as chance would have it, there was a battered volume. He pulled it out, and fate does strange things. For that battered volume turned out to be the diary and confession of the French priest who had gone mad and died. Most of it was commonplace, but again and again and again he would write in Latin, mea culpa, and a date, 87. And in the end, Collins went right back to the beginning of the diary, to that fateful year, and there he discovered why the priest was writing again and again, mea culpa. In a little crabbed entry, he wrote, the orphan has died, and I am to blame. I found out the story afterwards, because I was interested. The priest, it seemed, had once been given an orphan to look after. He was a rising fellow, and this orphan, who was a pauper's child, left to him in his will to turn into a priest, felt to him an encumbrance. So he had him taken by one of the orphanages, and had not been over careful in choosing the orphanage he sent him. And so it was in 87. There had been an outbreak of German measles, and worse, dysentery. The children were not fed well in that orphanage. And so it was his charge had died. And he had started the diary in memory, in confession of that grief. He said again and again, I will make amends all Souls Night. And Collins saw, that on each All Souls Night, he had copious notes of the requiem he had sung for the memory of the dead, his charge. Naturally enough, Collins turned to the last page, and there the requiem was broken off. I sung the beginning of Mozart's requiem, but I could not remember the mot. He had gone into Latin in his extremity. And Collins said there was something like grief, something like insanity in those last words. They must, put with such pressure, they would have broken the nib. As if his failure to sing that most elaborate of ceremonies for the dead, Mozart's requiem, alone in the chapel, was somehow a heinous sin to the memory of the dead. Collins says he broke off. He was trying to go to sleep, but he couldn't. It was All Souls Night. And had not the priest written earlier in the diary that there must be a requiem each night for the soul of the one he had caused to die, else he would go to hell. Collins, when he thought of that, looked into the dark. He had now blown out the candle, and it seemed to him for a moment the dark was a palpable thing. He describes it as looking back at him with sightless eyes. And then he felt something. He says he almost heard it, but he wasn't sure. A sob, single, of a man about Collins's age, so 30, crying once at the end of the bed and saying under his breath, mea culpa Deo, mea culpa. And the words that Collins had often read but never heard of the beginning of the Mass of Requiem. And Collins said it was more a feeling than actual hearing. He felt the words, felt them in his skull. Then all of a sudden there was a sound behind him, not from the end of the bed, but from the door. It was opened and closed, as if perhaps by a draught, perhaps. And Collins described himself getting up in his bedclothes and following something that seemed to be going in front of him, like an echo of a sadness that he had to understand. Down the deep, long passages, around a curved corridor that the Earl had not shown him earlier, but he knew was the passage that led to the chapel. And then at last, he said, it could have been a dream for all I know. I seemed to step within a great hall, the chapel, lit by candlelight, and there were figures, one small, one large, like shades or shadows, standing before the high altar. They turned and beckoned me, and I came up. And then a voice that was not quite my own, and not quite my own, for I did not know the words, but it was my tongue. It was my tongue. Started to sing in Latin, started to sing the Holy Requiem, which I knew not, according to the setting of Mozart. Most elaborate, my voice seemed to sing up and down and up, while the figures watched. But strange to say, they did not get relief from the beautiful words. Rather, it made them seem more desperate, more sad. At last, I don't know how long it lasted, I broke away, almost running out of the chapel. Looking back one last time, I saw not figures before the altar, but in my dream, or my dream of my dream, or in my waking mind, I saw two coffins, and the feeling of that oppression fed my soul with fear, and I ran to bed, and there I have written this account, and I shall stay awake tonight, for all around in the dark I can feel the sorrow, I can feel the shame, I can feel the fear. I dare not go to sleep, else it takes me over. It's there in the shadow. I'm sure it's there. I know what I shall do. I shall take a mirror. I shall watch my face by candlelight. I shall make sure that I stay myself. That which besets me, this sorrow, this lost soul in torment, cannot possess me. Tonight, to sing again the Requiem, tonight and all night on. They found him the next morning, staring at a mirror. But he couldn't have stared quite all night, because the very last things were written in, bizarrely, medieval Latin. I stare, but his eyes look at me from the mirror. Eyes that have ceased to be my own. And the ipse, my own, was written so deep that the nib must have broken in the pen. Well, they took Collins to Bodmin, and there he stays, poor chap. I hear they had a commotion this old salt's night because he started to sing and tried to get the other inmates to sing, and they had to tranquilise him. there is no hope of his recovery. So if you ask me this beautiful May week, whether memories and emotions haunt a place, I say if they are strong enough, perhaps. But whether that means it is a ghost story or a psychosis, I do not claim to be an expert. And so it is, old sorrows and joys linger long after the body